Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're doing something pretty specific.
Very specialized.
We're looking at source material that connects, well, high-level global policy with some very specific interpretations of biblical prophecy.
A complex area for sure, contentious for some.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're digging into an analysis of the UN Agenda 2030.
Right, those 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Climate, poverty, the works.
Exactly. But this material asks a really sharp question. Is Agenda 2030 actually the covenant with the many from the book of Daniel? Chapter 9, verse 27. You know, the one that many in the end times watching community see as the starting gun for the 7-year tribulation.
And just to give you some context, this question isn't totally out of the blue. No, it's gained traction because the groups pushing Agenda 2030, like the UN, the WEF, they're the ones framing it within that 7-year time frame leading up to 2030.
Right, that acceleration.
Exactly. So for prophetic watchers, it looks plausible. It feels like it could be the covenant.
But the source we're looking at lands somewhere else entirely.
It really does. The author's conclusion is definitive. Agenda 2030 is not the biblical covenant.
Okay, so if it's not the covenant, what is it?
They call it a dry run, a stepping stone. Basically, a global rehearsal to get nations used to the idea, to condition them for the real 7-year covenant later on.
That difference, dry run versus the real thing, that's pretty critical.
Absolutely. It changes how you see current events. If it's preparation.
Then the world's being primed. Okay, so the source gives reasons, right?
Yeah.
4 specific discrepancies.
Yeah, 4 main points why they say the UN plan doesn't fit the prophetic criteria. We can kind of group them.
How so?
Into 2 buckets, really. First, who the deal is actually for, and second, what the deal is, the substance of it.
Okay, let's start with the who. Who is this covenant supposed to involve according to the source?
Right. This is a major point of disagreement. Discrepancy number 1 is scope.
Scope, meaning?
Meaning Agenda 2030 was signed by, well, pretty much every nation on Earth. It's global. But the prophecy in Daniel, this author argues, is scripturally understood to be specifically about Israel.
Focused on Israel's destiny. Land, city, temple, that sort of thing.
Precisely. A period of discipline tied to those elements.
And this connects to that phrase, la rabim, right? The many. Some take that to mean everybody.
They do, but the source pushes back on that. They argue that while it sounds universal in this prophetic context, Laurabim means something more specific. Like many teachers or rabbis, essentially the leadership of Israel.
So the source is saying the real covenant has to be confirmed with Jewish leadership, not just a blanket deal with all nations.
That's the core argument, yeah. It must center on Israel.
Okay, that naturally leads to the second point, a guarantor.
Exactly. If the deal focuses on peace and security for Israel, who confirms it? Who makes it stick?
And the prophecy implies?
It implies it's confirmed by one man, a single powerful figure, usually identified as the Antichrist. And the author looks at Agenda 2030 and says, look, there are powerful people involved, sure, heads of state, CEOs.
Lots of them.
But there isn't one dominant individual visibly leading, guaranteeing, and confirming this specific UN plan in the way the prophecy seems to demand. That figure isn't on the scene yet in this context.
Okay. So scope and guarantor. This all seems to hang on a specific prophetic timeline, too.
Absolutely. The source really emphasizes this. They argue that the final 7 years, Daniel's 70th week, which they term the discipline of Israel, it must resume or begin only after another major event.
Which is?
The rapture, the removal of the church.
So getting into eschatology terminology here.
A little bit, yeah. The source holds that these last 7 years are exclusively for Israel's discipline relating to their earthly inheritance.
And the church body isn't part of that.
Not according to this interpretation. The source uses terms like the Philadelphian church type, representing faithful believers who are promised an escape from that period of wrath. So they weren't supposed to be here for Israel's national discipline.
Meaning the 7-year clock can't start until the church age is over.
That's the logic. Which clearly doesn't align with the current UN 2030 schedule, which is already underway.
Okay. That covers the who and the when.
Yeah.
What about the other discrepancies? The nature of the pact itself.
Right. Point 3 is about the pact's spiritual nature.
Spiritual? How so?
The biblical covenant isn't just described as, a political deal. The prophet Isaiah uses some pretty dark language. He likens it to a pact with the devil or even a deal with death.
Wow, okay. That's strong language.
Very, and that contrasts sharply with the 4th point. the moral distinction.
Meaning?
Meaning, while Agenda 2030 is ambitious, global, aims for huge changes, the source material doesn't describe it as requiring some kind of demonic allegiance.
It's not presented as a pact with Lucifer.
Exactly. That kind of explicit evil pact, the source argues, comes later with the mark of the beast, which will demand an act of worship.
Whereas Agenda 2030 is what? A set of policy goals.
Political and economic goals, yes. Transformative, perhaps, but not inherently demanding that kind of spiritual commitment described in Isaiah.
So, boiling this section down, the core principle the source uses is, what was it?
The sign is not the event.
Right. The sign is not the event. So Agenda 2030 is the sign, the primer, the rehearsal.
That's exactly how they frame it. Highly visible, getting the world used to the idea of a 7-year global plan.
Okay. If it's the dry run, conditioning the world.
Yeah.
Conditioning for what? What are the globalists, as the source calls them, accelerating towards?
The end goal, according to this analysis, is the implementation of a total control grid.
A total control grid. That sounds ominous.
Meant to.
Yeah.
And connecting this to the bigger picture, the source highlights the absolutely crucial role of finance, specifically a global financial reset.
How does that fit in?
The authors, and they use very charged language here, they state that the Luciferian powers that be are deliberately engineering the slow de-dollarization of the world economy.
Now, hold on. That's a big claim. Many economists see shifting trade balances, the rise of BRICS, as, natural geopolitical shifts. Does the source link standard economics directly to that kind of spiritual motive, or is that their interpretation?
It's definitely their interpretive leap, but they try to ground it by pointing to public statements.
What's that say?
They mention figures like former Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, her congressional testimony where she basically warned that, yes, Americans should expect the dollar's role as the sole world reserve currency to gradually diminish.
Okay, that happened.
But the source interprets that not as, say, economic reality or failure, but as a controlled demolition, a necessary step to clear the way for what comes next.
Which they say is?
The New World Order currency, a unified digital blockchain platform.
Okay, a global digital currency. We hear talk about CBDCs.
Right, but the critical piece here, according to the source, is how it's integrated. They infer this system will be directly tied to your personal identity.
Linking what, exactly?
Things like your vaccination status, maybe a social credit score, your federalized bank accounts, all potentially connected.
Creating one seamless system.
A total control financial matrix, yeah, where participation in the economy requires compliance with the system's parameters.
And this convergence, political, financial, and maybe even religious readiness, that's what the source thinks needs to happen.
That's what they suggest needs to fully mesh before the Luciferian globalists can pull it off, as they put it, every aspect integrated.
Okay, let's switch focus slightly to the calendar itself, the year 2030. It keeps popping up. UN, WEF, WHO. Why is that year so important in this interpretation?
It's not just about the Gregorian year 2030. The authors make a specific link to the corresponding Jewish calendar year, which spans 2029-2030.
And that deed is significant. How?
In their specific prophetic timeline, yes. They see 2030 not just as an endpoint for the UN goals, but as a designated turning point.
A turning point, like
the exact midpoint of Daniel's final week of years. The middle of the 7-year tribulation.
So they have a specific timeline mapped out.
They seem to. Based on their interpretation, they place the start of the tribulation around fall 2026, running to fall 2033, making 2030 the crucial halfway mark.
And what's supposed to happen at that midpoint? Why is it so significant?
It marks the culmination, they argue, of the effort to bring in the rule of the biblical Antichrist.
Okay.
And specifically, the source states this midpoint is when the abomination of desolation is prophesied to occur.
Right, another technical term. How does the source define that?
Pretty vividly. They interpret it as Lucifer himself, Satan, physically entering a rebuilt temple in Jerusalem, sitting on the mercy seat on top of the Ark of the Covenant and proclaiming himself to be God, demanding worship.
That is quite a picture. Stark, as you said.
It is. Yeah. And it explains, in their view, the current rush around Agenda 2030.
The urgency we see.
Exactly. The author stresses that this whole agenda isn't secret anymore. It's not covert or done in clandestine ways.
It's out in the open.
Very much so. They point to places like Davos, the WEF meetings, where global governance, digital IDs, population issues, they're discussed openly by world leaders.
And the source sees this openness, this rush,
as a sign of the times. proof that the preparation for that total control grid is happening fast because, according to their timeline, that critical 2030 midpoint event is getting closer. That's why all the fanfare.
Wow. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground there, synthesizing a really specific and, yeah, controversial take on world events.
We certainly have. We've pulled out the core arguments from this analysis.
The main takeaway being
that UN Agenda 2030, in this view, isn't the actual covenant with the many.
Right, it's the prep work.
Highly visible prep work, designed to condition the world for two key things down the line.
Which are?
First, the real covenant, which they believe centers on Israel, and second, the later implementation of that integrated digital financial system, what the source calls the Mark of the Beast financial matrix.
So for you listening, trying to make sense of all this, what's the implication?
Well, the analysis is obviously built on a very specific framework. That prophecy is fundamentally Israel-centered. And that the world population needs to be acclimated, made comfortable with the idea of a global 7-year plan and the mechanisms of a control system, this dry run, before the main event can happen.
The main event being that covenant confirmed by the Antichrist figure.
On a global scale, yes. That's the sequence they propose.
And that preparation phase, the conditioning, is what the source argues we're seeing right now.
That's their assertion.
Okay, let's leave you with a final thought to chew on, taken directly from this material. It's provocative. If, as these sources claim, the last generation would lose its mind, choosing to become, quote, reprobate. How does seeing current events, the push for digital ID, potential financial shifts, the focus on 2030s as possible, prophetic preludes or signs, how does that affect your critical assessment of what's happening in the world?
Something to think about.
Definitely something to think about. Join us next time for another deep dive.